of inclusive public history, digital humanities, urban studies, and 20th century U.S. cultural history. Her most recent book, Come and Be Shocked, Baltimore Beyond John Waters and the Wire, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2020, won the Arlene Custer Memorial Award from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference. She is also the author of Class Acts, Young Men and the Rise of Lifestyle, as well as articles in the New York Star Ledger, Washington Post, The Conversation, and other publications. She's the founder of the Chicory Revitalization Project, which uses the Black community poetry magazine Chicory to spur dialogue on place and identity, including through the exhibit Soul of the Butterfly, which Cleve just mentioned, Chicory Magazine, and Baltimore's Black Arts Activism, which I encourage you all to check out. As he said, it's down in Central Hall right now, but won't be there for much longer. And it is going to be opening at Southeast Anchor Library on September 12th. And then it's going to travel around to other Pratt Library branches over the next 2 years. So please join me in welcoming Mary Rizzo. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. I am so delighted to be here, and I was told not to move that microphone, and of course I just banged into it, so that's off to a good start. Now, I'm really so excited and delighted to be here, to see all the folks here in person on a rainy night. I really appreciate that, and of course the folks who are watching online. And I have to thank everyone at Pratt Library who made this possible, particularly Cleve, Caprice, Sophia, who were just amazing in planning and organizing this event. I also do want to say that for folks who may not be aware, there is an effort underway to unionize workers at Pratt Library, and I think that's an amazing thing, and I hope that you also will support Pratt Workers United, because it is the people of Pratt who make the library what it is, which is one of the most amazing institutions, I think, in this wonderful, wonderful city. All right, let me make sure I don't talk too long. So I'm going to put the timer on. So it's funny, as I was chatting with a friend about this talk, they were like, oh, you know, your title could be taken two ways. Like, you could be talking about like the occult, like the black arts in Baltimore. I was like, oh, that's really cool. I hope no one is disappointed that is not what my talk is about. But I did give my talk what I hope is a provocative title, and I did that on purpose, right? So Black Arts Baltimore, a counter history of the 1960s and 1970s, right? So when we say that there is something that is a counter history, I mean, that suggests, of course, that there is a standard history. There is something that is being countered, right? So what is that standard history then of Baltimore in the 1960s and 1970s, right? And I think there's no better way to think about standard history than to do a Google search, right? Because that's going to bring up what is sort of seen as the norm, right? What most people are going to find if they wanted to find out what was happening in Baltimore, particularly in Black Baltimore in the 1960s. So that's what I did. I put in Baltimore 1960s into Google and did an image search. And these are the first 8 or so 9 results. And as you can see, maybe you can see them, hopefully you can see them, most of these are about the 1968 riot. Right? The ones that are not about the riot are images of sort of streets devoid of people, so sort of just like architecture, the built environment. And then there is one image out of these 9 that shows the Royal Theater, which was on Pennsylvania Avenue in West Baltimore until the 1970s. So let's keep this in mind as what we may call the standard history of Baltimore in the 1960s, dominated by the 1968 riot. What's missing from that Google image search result are these images, right? What we see here are a plethora of events and activities that were going on in Baltimore in the 1960s and 1970s that were featuring and highlighting and promoting and making visible the work of Black artists in the city. This goes from an exhibit of art to a Black American Museum's anniversary in the 1970s, a fashion show and jazz performances in 1968, and a show of advertising work in 1979. No, I want to talk to you too. Sweet. Yes. Now. Oh, yeah, all right, excellent. I definitely want to talk to you. Now, because I'm focusing on images here, I do also want to read you one quote, right, which was published in the editorial note to a poetry chapbook published in Baltimore in 1964. The book is called In This Corner by Sam Cornish, who I'll talk about later. The editor noted, 1964, quote, "Poetry and art are now enjoying their best years in Baltimore. Instead of just one or two good poets, our town has at least 100. Huh. Who are those people, right? So while some of you, and we know already, have some personal experiences and memories of these events and these organizations and these topics that I'm talking about, I would argue that this flowering of Black cultural expression that we see in Baltimore in the 1960s and 1970s has been left out of the historical record about Black Baltimore. And instead, that historical record focuses on what I would call the sort of Baltimore declension story, or the Baltimore declension narrative, right? So when we look at what the media or most histories of Black Baltimore say about the 1960s, we really see sort of two different perspectives. There's one version, which you can call the sort of conservative version, which dates back to Spiro Agnew, governor of Maryland in 1968, and as recently, of course, as Donald Trump, which cites the 1968 riot after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination as the sort of turning point, the downward turning point in Baltimore's story. And in that version of the story, this conservative narrative, then, Black Baltimoreans are at fault. If the city has gone downhill, it is because of the fault of Black residents of the city, ignoring, of course, decades and decades of racist disinvestment in Baltimore's Black neighborhoods, right? So that's the sort of conservative version of the story. I would also argue then that there's like a liberal version of that story. And in the liberal version of the story, Black Baltimoreans are the victims of racist oppression. And that racist oppression dates to at least the early 20th century, with the passing of laws creating residential segregation in the city of Baltimore, right? So Baltimore engineered the first housing segregation laws in the country. And for folks who are writing this liberal narrative, they see a direct line between those laws in the early 20th century to, let's say, the uprising after Freddie Gray's murder in 2015. So the Black Baltimoreans then are victims of racist oppression and, of course, also financial disinvestment, right? That story is closer to the truth, certainly, right? They are acknowledging the way that racism has worked in Baltimore. But what I'd like to say is that both of those stories are missing something. And I'd like to tell a sort of different version of this story. And the counter history that I'm beginning to work on, and this is very preliminary, so this is why I'm really hoping we have time for Q&A, because I'd love to hear from folks about what your thoughts are on this and your knowledge of these topics, right? But the counter history that I want to tell centers the activism of Black Baltimoreans in the 1960s and 1970s. And in this regard, I'm building on the work of a number of different amazing scholars who have worked on Baltimore: Lawrence Brown, Rhonda Williams, Harold McDougall, Maricela Gomez, Judson Jeffries, and also Nicole King, who is in the room. Her wonderful co-edited book, Baltimore Revisited, which is edited with Kate Drabinski and Joshua Clark Davis. These are all folks who I am like walking in the footsteps of, who have really thought a lot about how to think about Black Baltimoreans as active agents in challenging the structures that are oppressing them. The approach that I've taken that I think is a little bit different is to center the work of artist activists. So what does it mean when we look at activism by artists and people who felt that culture was actually a really important site for activism? So this is sort of the my sort of big picture of what I'm arguing tonight, right? Which is that in the 1960s and 1970s, Black Baltimore artist activists conceptualized arts and culture as a tool to empower and radicalize the Black working class. And I should say that those artist activists were also from the working class, right? So that they are within that community, and they are working from the grassroots. In order to do this, they created new institutions, and this ranged from publishing companies to magazines to schools and museums. And through these venues, they wanted to spread these ideas. So these artist activists were inspired by and connected to national and international movements like the Black Arts Movement. But they were deeply attuned to the local particularities of Baltimore. And again, this is, they came from those grassroots and they wanted to affect change at that grassroots level. But by the late 1970s and early 1980s, most of these organizations and activities were gone. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is later. So when I was in grad school, one of my professors would always say to the grad students, when you came up to him with an idea, he'd be like, so what? Who cares, right? And he didn't mean that in a negative way, although it was very scary at the time. What he meant was you need to articulate the significance of what you're talking about, right? So why should we care about the story of Black artist activists in Baltimore? So I think there are a few reasons. First, these stories happened. These people lived. These organizations existed. Right? And for that reason alone, we should acknowledge them as part of the historical record, right? But I also think what's to build on that we need to think about, when we think about activism, we need to think about activism from the perspective of the activists themselves. And for these folks back then, arts were central to activism. They were not a separate sphere of activity. And so we need to think about that as well when we talk about activism. I also think that there's a real moment right now where there are so many groups in Baltimore that are recovering this heritage and history, that are doing great work on Baltimore's Black arts history. So the West Baltimore Cultural Heritage District, the Black Arts District, the Lucille Clifton House, right? All doing great work. And I think that these stories that I'm telling help to even more elevate the work that they're doing by linking them to a longer history. Because to be honest, when you look at what Black cultural production in Baltimore looked like, mostly what people talk about are folks like Cab Calloway and Billie Holiday and the clubs on Pennsylvania Avenue. Those are all very important, but neither Holiday nor Calloway spent actually much time in Baltimore. And Pennsylvania Avenue, as you all probably know, by the 1970s had been basically destroyed by urban renewal. So it would make it seem like there was nothing in between the 1920s and after 1971, when the Royal Theater is demolished. So this story, I think, fills in those gaps. And the last thing I would say is that, again, Baltimore is in a moment where the arts and culture are being promoted heavily in the city. And I think that that's fantastic, but I also think that it is potentially a little dangerous, because sometimes when cities promote arts and culture, they do so in a way that promotes gentrification, and it does not actually benefit the people who live in that city. So I think that this history of local artist activists who are embedded in the grassroots is important to remember as Baltimore artists and activists today are working to make sure that their work is community oriented. So tonight, stop with all the prologue. So tonight, what I'm going to talk about are two things. Well, I'm going to talk about one person, poet Sam Cornish, and then one organization, the Soul School. And I'm going to examine how each of these envisioned what Black arts activism looked like in Baltimore. And then I'll wrap up by talking a little bit about the difficulties of writing this history. And then I want to hear from all of you. Okay, so let's talk about Sam Cornish. So Sam Cornish was born in Baltimore in 1935, and he dies in Boston in 2018. In between, he was a professional poet, writer, educator, a bookstore owner, and he served as the first poet laureate of Boston for several years, right? If you are familiar with Black poetry, Cornish is a name that you might know, right? He's still remembered today for his work as an important poet of the African-American experience in the mid-20th century. And in fact, actually in 2020, his work was included in the anthology African-American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song, which was edited by Kevin Young. Right? Now, Cornish's journey to becoming a professional writer coincided with the rise of the Black arts movement, which has been called the artistic companion to Black power. And even though Cornish published his poetry in Black arts journals and books like the anthology Blackfire, which was published in 1969, he was really actually quite ambivalent about the Black arts movement, which I think is quite interesting. But he started the poetry magazine Chicory, which I'll talk a little bit about later, which became, I would say, a sort of centerpiece of Baltimore's Black arts movement. So what did arts activism mean for someone like Sam Cornish? So I got to interview Sam in 2016, a couple of years before he passed away. And as I was talking to him about what he saw as sort of his work and what was important to him about the work that he was doing in Baltimore in the 1960s and 70s, he said this, right? In the 1960s, there was a great emphasis placed on the value of common speech and what people have to say to each other. Also the rhythm of everyday speech. Literature is something that is with us. The difference would be that you're working with people who are between the civil rights era and the Black Power era. You're living in the period of transition. That makes it even more interesting. So what I think is embedded in this statement is a sort of summary of Sam Cornish's vision of what he saw as Black arts activism, right? So for him, what was really important was class, right? He wanted to highlight and focus on working class Baltimoreans like himself. And as part of that, he saw their everyday language, the way people just talk to each other on the street, as poetry, right? It was not something that someone needed to be trained to do. You did not need to write like a white poet to be a poet for Sam Cornish. He saw people's own language as actually being the sort of highest kind of poetry. Right? So these two defining elements I think are really important to keep in mind. There's also another thing that I would say is definitional for Sam Cornish, which is that he saw that it was critically important to create institutions that would support this kind of work. And we'll come back to that later. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about Sam Cornish's biography and sort of show you how these ideas about Black arts activism come from his own life story. So Cornish was, as I said, born in 1935. His mother was a widow, so he grew up fairly poor. It was him and his brother and his grandmother and his mother who lived in a house on McCullough Street in West Baltimore. They were on welfare off and on. They had it was a tough time. And if you read his poetry about this period, he describes the house as being full of shadows and darkness and cold, right? It was definitely a very difficult childhood. He graduates from Henry Highland Garnett School and then goes to Frederick Douglass High School. For folks who are from Baltimore, you know Frederick Douglass High School is an all-Black high school, but he drops out. Right? He doesn't finish high school. And in part, of course, you know, he's growing up in a poor family. He needs to go to work to support his family. But it was not only that. And I think that that's really important. He actually found going to an all-Black high school very alienating because of his working class background. So that, you know, if you think about it, it was an all-Black high school. So that means that it's drawing students from around the city and from across the class spectrum. So now all of a sudden, he's going to school with folks who are Black, but also middle class. Right? And he felt like they looked down on him and he felt like he did not fit in at all. So it made him much more aware of how poor his family was and the class lines that existed in Baltimore's Black community by going to an all-Black high school. As he said in an interview, quote, "There was at that time a class structure in the Black community which was very hard for me to fit into." And also he describes colorism as having a real role here. So, quote, "The Black community at that time for me was very color biased, very light complected, straight hair was almost a requirement." So we see this young man who drops out of high school because he feels alienated due to his class position, right? He doesn't feel like he fits in with a sort of more middle class Black people that he's meeting at his high school. At the same time, he doesn't fit into the world of working class Black West Baltimore either, right? Especially the male sort of street culture. So his own brother, Herman, he said, quote, "sold out to the street petty criminal life, chasing women," and I don't mean dating, and causing his mother a sort of endless grief. And Cornish described this as rather deplorable. So we see this young man who's torn, right? He doesn't know where to find himself. So he begins to work some odd jobs. He works as a janitor. He works in a hospital, right? But the place where he finds home are in the bookstores of Baltimore and at Pratt Library. He said that, quote, he made friends with the, quote, few librarians that like strange-looking Negro kids with big eyeglasses, right? He felt like Pratt was his second home. So he talked about, and he talked about this with me even in 2016, right? He devoured as many books as he could, right? He read everything. One of the things that I think is really fascinating for a Black young man growing up in working class West Baltimore is that his favorite author was James T. Farrell, who is probably most famous for writing the Studs Lonigan trilogy. So he is a white Chicago Irish author whose Studs Lonigan trilogy is all about white Irish kids in Chicago. But Cornish felt like he could see himself in that. He felt a real sort of connection to that world that Farrell was talking about. And I think that that's important because Cornish connected with him across these racial lines, but there was something about sort of class that was really important there. And also, Cornish ends up being very skeptical because I think of his wide reading. He ends up being very skeptical of some ideas around Black separatism that are becoming popular in the 1960s. He writes a memoir called 1935, which is really interesting. And in it, he describes how there was a Black Muslim temple near where he grew up. And the Black Muslims would always make fun of him because he was reading books by white authors, right? So he felt like they were missing the point. His idea was to read as widely as possible because he wanted to get ideas and inspiration from everywhere, right? So to return to his biography, he goes to the Army in 1958, comes back to Baltimore in 1960. And this is where he gets involved with socialist activism in the city of Baltimore. So in 1963, a communist bookstore opened in Baltimore called the New Era Bookshop. Cornish is hanging out there a lot. He also gets involved with the Students for a Democratic Society, which is a college group that sort of fanned out around the country to cities to do the Economic Research and Action Project, which is to do community organizing around economic issues. So he gets involved with SDS there. This is an interracial group. They're pretty radical. He begins teaching at a free school. So he's doing all this kind of like radical activism. One of the most interesting things, and one of the people that he saw as most influential on his thinking was a socialist named Bob Kaufman in Baltimore who ran for office unsuccessfully many times. And it's really interesting because Kaufman and these other folks who were coming at this from a socialist perspective really opened his eyes to the idea that the working class could be a driving force in history, that we could think about sort of class in that way. So, but what's interesting, of course, is that if the Black Muslims criticized Cornish for reading white authors, Kaufman criticized him for reading reactionary authors, as he called them, right? Elite people, not people who are writing from the perspective of the working class, right? But what Cornish says about it is that, quote, Kaufman and the others treated me with more respect, and their radical views came out of a history of Blacks and Jews, men and women, right? So he has this sort of intersectional kind of thinking at this moment that is, wants to see interracial possibilities. So there's a politics of class happening for him, but also a poetics around class as well. And he writes this beautiful poem for Bob Kaufman, showing how deeply influential he was. But I also want to say that even though I've been emphasizing Cornish's thinking about class, he was also highly aware of Jim Crow in Baltimore and the way that race structured the life opportunities of Black people in Baltimore, as I think the excerpt from this amazing poem, The South Was Waiting in Baltimore, very clearly shows, right? So in 1964, Cornish begins publishing poems in the Afro newspaper, and his first chapbook, which is called In This Corner, just published by Fleming McAllister Press, which, as far as my research shows, was just like run by two people, two Black poets. In 1965, he publishes his second book, People Beneath the Window, which is published by Sacco Publishers, which is a press operating out of the communist New Era bookstore, which is why it's called Sacco, right, for Sacco and Vanzetti. So that's really interesting to me too, right? So he takes these books and he shows them to Eliot Coleman, who's the head of the Johns Hopkins University Writing Seminar, which is one of the most prestigious writing programs in the country. And he invites Sam Cornish, who again is a high school dropout, to sit in on his writing classes. At the same time, about the same time, Cornish is hired by Edwin Castagna, who is the director of Pratt Library. So Cornish begins to work at Pratt in various roles, including as a community outreach liaison with Black teens from East Baltimore. And this is where I would say Cornish really develops his artistic vision. which is to center the voices of regular Black folks through his library work, and then to use this position to help begin to build institutions, especially small publications and presses that could give those voices a platform, right? So one place that he puts this into practice is this magazine Chicory, which is published between 1966 and 1983 through Pratt Library. And Chicory, if we want to say that Chicory had an aesthetic, its aesthetic was small d democratic, right? It was rooted in giving working class Black Baltimoreans across the age spectrum, so like literally people who are 5 years old to 85 years old published in this magazine, right, a space to express themselves freely. One of the things I love best, and so here's sort of a summary, or the sort of manifesto of Chicory, right? The magazine for people who don't like to write but have something to say. Right? One of the things that I love best about Chicory is that throughout the issues are published things what are called street chatter. And this is literally like overheard in Baltimore. So like Cornish would be walking around on the street, or one of the other editors, and they'd hear something and they'd be like, that's poetry. So we're going to publish it. So some of these are just amazing. I've given you a few examples, but I'll just read the one on the right. Standing on North and Penn Avenues, the smell of collards, the sound of cue balls, and the Holy Baptist Church of Solid Rock, they told it like it was, right? So what's important here, again, is the way that Cornish is finding the poetry, recognizing the poetry in everyday people's speech. So he's encouraging folks to discover the poetry of their own language and their own voice. He doesn't want them to try to sound like white poets, which would have been what was sort of defined real poetry at the time. And he creates Chicory as an institution that gives people this platform. He also created two other small magazines in Baltimore. One was called Beanbag and the other was called Mimeo. Beanbag was a lot like Chicory, actually, and it was published through the Strawbridge Methodist Church. While Mimeo magazine was more like a sort of artistic poetry magazine, which published people from around the country. And he also created his own press later on called Beanbag Press, but that was after he left Baltimore. So I just have to take a little pause, a little detour here. So as we mentioned, right, the Chicory Revitalization Project is working on keeping the visibility of Chicory alive. So you've heard a little bit about the exhibit. You can also read every issue of Chicory online, and there are some other resources if you are a teacher, for example, and you're interested in using Chicory in your classroom. So to get back to Cornish, he leaves Baltimore for Boston in 1967, comes back to work with Chicory in 1969 and 1970. Co-edits a book of Chicory poems called Chicory Young Voices from the Black Ghetto, which was published in 1969, right? And then he goes back to Boston permanently. So to summarize here, right, what's radical about Cornish's vision of Black working class self-expression is that the dominant viewpoint of this era was that elite people, whether they were Black or white, needed to speak for working class Black people, right? But he really asserted the opposite, and created institutions that allowed them to do that. So let's jump to a different example that is quite different from Cornish's arts activism, which is the Soul School. So in 1968, this new school opened up in West Baltimore, opened at 522 West Fremont Street. It was called the Society of United Liberators, or the Soul School. It was founded as a Black nationalist alternative to the Baltimore public schools. So it was free to attend, and it was run by volunteers, and it sought to connect the arts and culture with Black liberation through this idea of cultural nationalism. Okay. So, there were some groups at the time period, like the Black Panthers, right, that saw cultural nationalism as apolitical. Right? It wasn't real politics. They called it sort of dismissively pork chop nationalism, right? But for the Soul School, cultural nationalism is a way to bring together cultural activities, so arts and culture, educational reform, and political and community organizing, right? And as you'll see, the Soul School represented a very different vision than Cornish's in a lot of ways. So the basic sort of central belief for the Soul School was that connecting African Americans to their African heritage through arts and culture would lead this community to challenge the dominant white power structure in Baltimore as part of this global struggle for liberation, right? So for those of you who may not be familiar, cultural nationalism was not a new idea in the 1960s. We can look back to Marcus Garvey in the early 20th century, or the Nation of Islam as well in the middle of the 20th century, who are all advocating for this idea that kind of culture needs to be central to Black nationalism. But by the mid-1960s, this really had become much more visible as part of the rise of the Black Power movement. So nationalists believed that Black Americans were a nation within a nation, a cohesive group that had a shared history and needs, and they should be able to determine their own political, economic, and social futures. And cultural nationalists argue that you can't have a nation without culture and heritage. A nation is defined by having a shared culture, a shared history. And there are a lot of people who are articulating these ideas in the 1960s and 1970s. Probably the most important in the US were Maulana Karenga, who ran the US organization, and Amiri Baraka, who, among many things, ran an organization called the Congress of African People. And so the sort of basic theory of cultural nationalists is that they believe that white people had stripped African Americans of all connections to their history and heritage through enslavement. So language was lost, religion was lost, cultural practices were lost. And that white people then had filled in those gaps with white history and white culture, while also using education, science, social science, and popular culture to denigrate Black culture through stereotype. So for the Soul School, education was sort of two-pronged. On one hand, education was a way that white people had exerted control over Black people, had shaped their consciousness through educational systems that were racist. So on the other hand, though, for the Soul School, they wanted to take over education in order to radically transform people's consciousness at the time. So the Soul School in Baltimore is actually part of a network of cultural nationalist schools like this that began with the New School for Afro-American Thought in Washington, D.C. And that was created in 1966 by Gaston Neal, Donald Freeman, and Rimsky-Atchison. I should say that Gaston Neal was a poet. So again, arts and culture are always central to this. And the goal there was to teach Black youth about their history and culture to prepare them to fight for liberation. Now, to create a school to do this, right, is also, of course, a critique of the public education system. So Brown versus Board of Education had theoretically desegregated schools in 1954, but Black activists a decade later were arguing that that had not happened at all. And in fact, segregation continued, and that resources were being distributed unequally between Black and white schools. And beyond these issues of resources, the curriculum was also critiqued. So the curriculum was seen as supporting white supremacy and undermining Black students. And Gaston Neal, who started the school in DC, himself was motivated to do this in part because a white teacher had told him to drop out of school because the teacher, quote, had no knowledge or understanding of Black folks and where they come from or what they do. So therefore, all he could see was that it was hopeless for me to stay in school. All he wanted to do was get rid of the burden. And then it's very interesting when we look at Baltimore, there's a piece published in Chicory in 1971 by a teenage girl where she writes about the sort of racism she feels from her white teacher in school. So she says in Chicory, quote, "I wrote something about the Black movement because my teacher, he made me mad. He's white, and during a discussion of Reconstruction, he kept saying, you know how Negroes were so ignorant. He was talking about Negroes. He wasn't talking about Black people, you know." So we see there, right, this young girl's experience of seeing sort of the racism of her teacher right in the classroom, and wanting to fight back against that. Right? So when we look at the Soul School, right, what was it actually doing, right? So we see that it is trying to connect people in Baltimore to their Black heritage. It sees art as a kind of consciousness raising and way to build community, but also art is a kind of political education. It helps people think about why the world is the way it is in order to get them to challenge the dominant white power structure. So one of the few historical artifacts about the soul school that I found actually is in Chicory. And there was an issue of Chicory in 1968 that was published like sort of in partnership with the Soul School, and they reprinted poems from Soul School students, but also its sort of manifesto, right? And so you can see a little bit here, the highlighted part, right? Ed says, at the school, great emphasis is always put on increasing the Black man's awareness of his long, proud heritage. Much stress is also placed on understanding the present powerlessness of Black communities and the creation of ways and means to change the condition. In order to accomplish these things, the Soul School offers courses and activities in the history of the Black man in America and Africa, Swahili, Arabic, self-defense, first aid, community organizing, sewing, and the arts, painting, photography, music, etc. And I have to say, I find that fascinating. And right, when I teach about this, I always ask my students about it, right? Why these courses? Like, they list like a handful of classes, and this is their curriculum. What logically connects these things to each other? What makes sewing and Swahili make sense together, right? And I think the sort of answer to that is this idea of cultural nationalism and of creating an education system that will empower people in the present to address the world around them and to be able to shape and change and become self-sufficient, right? So that one of the things the Soul School had was a gift shop called the Mau Mau Hut, and it sold African, African artifacts and also clothing, African-style clothing. Were those clothes that were made by the kids who were in the sewing classes? Maybe. But the idea was that the gift shop would help support and fund the school, right? Leading to an independent sort of funding structure. So, we see the way this curriculum is designed for empowerment through arts and culture, as well as through educating folks about this kind of heritage and history. And the people themselves who started the school also did this in their own lives, right? So the founders included Alagbala Balagun, who was born Benjamin McMillan, for example. And so this taking on of a new name, a Swahili-inspired name, was, of course, a very visible means of asserting a new identity, right? One of my favorite stories about the Soul School is when there was a Black Tenants Association at the Murphy Homes, right? Housing project in East Baltimore. And they invited Alagbala to display and talk about African carvings and paintings. So they wanted him to bring these African art artifacts with him and talk about them with the residents of the building, right? So he goes to this tenants association meeting, and he's really surprised because, of course, the tenants were Black, but the management of the building was white. And some of the white management of the building was at this meeting, right? And according to one of the residents who was there, a woman named Gladys Spell, Alagbala says, I wouldn't even be here if I had known you were going to have the blue-eyed devil sitting in here. They don't mean you no good. You should kill them right now, right? So the white managers leave. They're like, okay, that's fine. We're out, right? But what's really interesting and important about that story is that then the Black tenants sit and talk with Alagbala, and after having this conversation with him, and I don't know what happened in that conversation exactly, but after that, they demand that they have a Black manager for their building, right? So that they feel like a Black manager will be more responsive to the concerns they have as tenants. So what we can see there is this interesting way in which a sort of discussion about arts and culture literally morphs into a political demand or a kind of community organizing demand, and they do end up getting a Black manager. Now, the Soul School also created public spaces and public events that could bring the Black community together around Black art and this sort of African cultural heritage, right? So the little clip on the bottom left talks about a African-style wedding that took place at the Soul School in 1968. Bob Moore, who was the director of the Students Nonviolent Coordinating Committee chapter in Baltimore, got married to Sheila Lewis at the Soul School in an African-style wedding. But there were 150 people who attended. So this is a wedding, but it is also a sort of cultural performance, right? A way to show what the African heritage would actually look like. We see other events here. So there is a Black Arts Festival that the Soul School puts on, and this is in 1968 and happened at Harlem Park Junior High School, which was billed as, quote, the first such event to be held in Baltimore. And the other picture, which is not great, I apologize, is a depiction of African artifacts and art. So what we can think about is like a community event like this brings people together, claims space, and also begins to introduce people to these ideas and to connect them to each other around these ideas. And then we also see how the students of the Soul School then began to take these ideas and express them. So here are a couple of excerpts of poems that were written in Chicory magazine by students at the Soul School, right? So, you can see that they're quite different in tone, but I think the slave woman poem on the bottom is really quite interesting because it's a young woman imagining what the thoughts and experience of an enslaved woman would have been as she is being transported to the US. And so it contrasts her being once, quote, queen of a fertile plain to the slave ship, which is a land of dread and endless night, and really thinks about gender-based violence. But it ends, and I'm sorry, it's a long poem, so I wasn't able to reproduce the whole thing, but the poem ends with the poet describing how this woman's children will be a source of hope because, quote, they will live to reap the flowers. And it seems to me like this poet is suggesting that, she is symbolically a child of this woman, and that they will, because they are learning this heritage and this history, and they are fighting for liberation, they are sort of finally taking back the power that had been lost. One thing that I think is interesting to note that I don't know a lot about is the sort of gender issues around the Soul School. A lot of cultural nationalist groups were very masculine and traditional gender roles. I don't know exactly what the Soul School's gender role ideology. That seems like all the leadership was men. I do think it's interesting that these two poems seem to be by young women. So something that I need to look at more. But I also want to say that the Soul School engaged in a lot of actual activism. So they fought against police brutality. There was a very famous case at the time where a Baltimore police officer had his dogs attack a Black family, and the Soul School helped to lead a group, a coalition of organizations, which included the NAACP, which was quite middle class, very different than the Soul School, but was part of this effort to get that police officer fired, which he was. They also protested mass incarceration as part of what they called the Harriet Tubman prison movement. They did protests about West Baltimore businesses that were owned by white people but served Black customers and didn't hire Black employees. So they were out on the streets a lot, right? Which is partially why they get watched by the FBI and the Baltimore Police Department. So as I mentioned, the Soul School ends in 1972. Why it closes, I don't exactly know, but I absolutely believe that the surveillance by the Baltimore police and the FBI were a key part of it, right? So Baltimore Police Commissioner Donald Pomerleau had one of the most aggressive red squads in the country, and it was called the Inspectional Services Division. And through it, using illegal methods, he kept eyes on 125 different groups, everything from the American Friends Service Committee to the Black Panthers to the Soul School, including politicians, whatever. They did tons of illegal stuff. They photographed people at protests in order to harass them. They wiretapped phones and recorded conversations with no cause. This was all revealed. These activities were revealed in the mid-1970s thanks to an investigation by the newspapers and the state legislature, which showed how pervasive this was. But it wasn't just the Baltimore Police Department, it was also the FBI as well. And partially, it's probably because DC is so close to Baltimore, it was very easy for FBI agents to engage in this kind of surveillance. And many people here are probably familiar with COINTELPRO, which was the FBI program to surveil Black radical groups as well. So the Soul School is part of it. Now, what's interesting, of course, as a historian, is the way in which some of my best information about the Soul School comes from the FBI's surveillance of it. So that notice I showed earlier about the African-style wedding is actually from an FBI report that was monitoring their activities, right? So there's something really ironic there about the way in which the surveillance helps to destroy this organization, but as records, it's some of the most detailed records that we have, right? And so for the FBI, for the FBI, they're arguing that they're monitoring the Seoul School because they are an organization that is trying to advocate for the overthrow of the government. And as they say here, that the Seoul School has guns in small quantities and are planning revolutionary activities. I have no idea if that's true or not, right? What I know about it is that it was an educational organization, but certainly this was a moment of a lot of revolutionary activity going on. So is it possible? I don't know, but certainly that is the way the FBI justified its surveillance of it today. All right, so I don't want to, I'm coming to the end of my time, and I definitely want to have time for questions, right? So let me just wrap up with a couple of things. As I mentioned, this is sort of initial research, right? So I talked for a long time about these two different groups. There's a lot of other people and organizations that I've begun to gather information about. I'm particularly interested in Walter Lively, a Black civil rights activist who started a museum, the Black Community Museum, that I'd love to find out more information about. But then there are also many other activities that were happening at this time period. There's the Black American Museum, there was a Black Arts Media Project, there's a Black Arts Calendar. There's lots and lots of people and activities happening around these issues. The difficulty is that it is really hard to research this because there are no archives. There's not one sort of central archival place that I can go to and find all of these records. So instead, it's really about sort of teasing out material from all sorts of different places, like FBI records, like going to Pratt Library's Maryland Room, which has amazing, amazing stuff. But it's really sort of bits and pieces. So I'm really working hard to try to find out as much as I can and sort of, to continue my metaphor, suture things together, which is why, as Cleve mentioned, I have this survey, which I would love if you're here in the room, if you could fill it out here and leave it for me. If you're online, there should be a link to it. And really the survey is not for you necessarily to tell me whether you liked my talk or not, but that's great. If you want to tell me that, that's awesome. But it's really more if you have information that you would like me to know about and that I could speak to you further about would be incredibly helpful to me. So thank you, Cleve, for handing that out. So I just want to end with a sort of, to sum up, sort of why do we care? Why should we care about the arts as part of activism? And I think about what Robin Kelley, the amazing historian, writes in his book, Freedom Dreams, which is this: unless we have the space to imagine and a vision of what it means to realize our humanity, all the protests and demonstrations in the world won't bring about our liberation. And I think, to me, that's the sort of key part that arts and culture plays. It is the space for imagining, and it is the space for envisioning. And so by looking back at this history and thinking very seriously about what Black artist activists were envisioning and imagining at this time period, then we are better able to understand and see this counter history of Baltimore at this moment. So thank you all.
We have time for about 15 minutes of questions. I ask that you adjust them to this microphone. It doesn't amplify, but we have about 40 people watching online, and they'll be able to hear your question if you use this mic. Thank you.
Cleve, would you like to, can I bring it to people, or is that?
Yeah, we can
if
do
anybody's
that.
got a question,
Sure,
I'm happy
yeah.
to, does anybody want to?
Questions, comments, your own experiences, memories,
We have a
suggestions?
couple from online that we're going to start with.
Oh, fantastic.
So this is in relation to your slide, the slide that is currently up. And they ask, is this from the Sun? Oh, no, sorry. This is about the Blacks Watch Closely, police memos indicate one. Yes. Is this from the Sun or the Afro?
I believe this is from the Sun. I'd have to go back and check for sure, but I'm pretty sure it's from the Baltimore Sun.
Perfect.
Great. All right. That was an easy question. Yeah, that's what I thought too. Yeah. You can kind of tell.
How does redlining and blockbusting relate to Black activism in the century?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Did you want to repeat that, or do you want
I was
to?
going to say,
Mary, you just want to repeat that.
Sure, I can repeat
Go
it.
ahead.
So your question is about how does redlining and, sorry, what was the second?
Blockbusting.
And blockbusting relate to Black activism? Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I would say that it is deeply related. So for example, the neighborhoods where we see the folks that I'm looking at living are places that are redlined and going through blockbusting. What comes to my mind immediately is Sam Cornish, when he comes back to West Baltimore in 1960, after he's in the Army and he's gone for 2 years, he comes back and he finds his neighborhood completely changed. And he describes how, like, things are, businesses have left, right? Churches are empty. Everything's been sort of hollowed out. In part because of what's going on with, in that case, probably more urban renewal at the time, but that it is deeply shredding the sort of fabric of these communities. So I think that that's absolutely key. I mean, and we can put as part of that, the fact that that in Baltimore, you see segregated housing projects, which become then spaces, which is interesting. Ironically, then they also become spaces where the sort of Black activism can take place as well. So they're the product of these racist policies, but then they also can become places where activism happens.
Yes. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have another online question. There we go. Did the Soul School overlap with the Black Panthers? Were some of the same people involved?
That's a great question. So the Soul School absolutely overlapped with the Black Panthers. And I didn't talk about the Black Panthers here. There was a chapter of the Black Panther Party in Baltimore, which was absolutely decimated again by police overreach and surveillance, and just outright sort of lying about the activities of the Black Panther Party. I didn't talk so much about the Black Panther Party because they, as Marxist revolutionaries, they were less interested in the sort of cultural aspects than a group like the Soul School. But for sure, they overlapped. What I think is interesting, and not to get too in the weeds of like the history or the historiography and what scholars are saying, right? But there's been a sort of idea that groups like the Soul School and groups like the Black Panther parties were completely separate from each other because they had such different viewpoints, right? But what we see happening in Baltimore on the local level is actually there was a lot of overlap because this is, Baltimore is a small enough city that for activists who are working on these issues, they are going to be engaging with each other. Now, it didn't always work out great. So there's with the Harriet Tubman prison movement that I mentioned earlier, there was supposed to be like a public press conference about it, and there were supposed to be folks from the Soul School and the Black Panther Party there, along with other folks. And the Black Panther Party folks and the Soul School Party folks were in a fight, so they decided not to attend. So they ended up not speaking at this event, but other people did. So there were personality clashes, certainly, but yes, there was overlap, and I think they worked together more closely than you might expect, given how different their ideologies were. Mm-hmm.
As a follow-up to that, with Paul Coates, with the Black Classic Press, was that, even if
Yes.
they weren't working together at the time, was there any influence going forward beyond this to people who had previous, have you found any influence with Black Classic Press or any of the later movements?
Yeah, that's a great question. So question was about Black Classic Press, which opens, I believe, in the 1980s, right? So after this, but is there a sort of, has there influences between what I'm talking about here and things and activities like Black Classic Press, which is run by Paul Coates, former Black Panther Party member in Baltimore, and which reprints and prints exactly what it sounds like, classics of sort of Black activist literature. So I think it's interesting, right? There are definitely connections, and actually I found out not that long ago that Chicory magazine was carried by, because Paul Coates, before he started Black Classic Press, ran a bookstore called The Black Book. And that, you could get issues of Chicory at The Black Book, which I think is really interesting. Because Chicory as again, I think its politics were not like always sort of explicit in like the sort of way that the Black Panther Party was. So something that I think is really, I was struck by this when I was reading the book of Paul Coates and what's the name of the other gentleman? Eddie Conway, exactly. So this book, beautiful book, was published a couple of years ago, which is about the two of them and their friendship. And one of them is talking about how there's a sort of story of how a Chinese general asked his soldiers, "What's the most powerful weapon you could have?" And they go through this list, and he's like, "Wrong, wrong, wrong, wrong." And someone says, "A printing press." And he's like, yes, that's the right one, right? So I think that's the connection point, right? Is that this idea that you need to control information and you need to control how you get information out. So Black classic press, I think, is explicitly that, and that can be connected to sort of these small presses that someone like Sam Cornish is running, or like the Communist New Era Bookshop is running.
It's another virtual question. It's not a virtual question. It's an actual question that was submitted virtually. They're wondering if members of CORE overlap with Soul School.
Yeah, so CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, had a chapter in Baltimore, and in fact, actually CORE, which is one of the leading civil rights organizations of the civil rights movement era, actually named Baltimore its target city in 1966, which meant that there was a ton of activity happening by CORE in the city of Baltimore, including a conference and a lot of different kinds of organizing work. And the answer is yes. There was definitely overlap, so that you see members of CORE being involved with different sort of actions that Soul School members are at. So there was a group that was called the Black United Front, which was intended to be a way of bringing all these different sort of civil rights organizations together to work together as a coalition. So we definitely see Soul School members, CORE members, SNCC, and other groups as well participating. Yeah. So yeah, there was a lot of cross-pollination that was going on at the time. Running back before, you should say.
Great. This has been a fantastic talk. You see parallelism with activism in the arts. Devin Allen, local resident photographer on the cover of Time, very uprising for more portraits.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I think is really important to me about this project, whatever this project ends up being, is that there is so much amazing artwork being created in Baltimore right now. There is so much cultural production happening in Baltimore right now that is explicitly activist, and that is done by people who see themselves as activists. And I've gotten to work with some of those folks through the Chicory Revitalization Project, like on the exhibit that we've been mentioning, where we worked with a lot of young people who are poets and writers. And it's really been gratifying and amazing to introduce them to this history and see how meaningful it is to them to find out about this, because they don't know about this history, right? They didn't live it. They're too young to have lived through it themselves, and this isn't recorded anywhere. So to me, I think that it's really important to uplift these stories, because it gives these sort of young artist activists today a genealogy that they can look back on. And again, I think it's really important that the genealogy here in Baltimore, to me, is so deeply embedded in the grassroots in a way that it is not in other cities. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll have to repeat this, but I noted that the Baltimore Beat, a new Black-led print publication, in really the legacy of Chicory, had a poet from someone who you guys worked with. And can you talk a little bit about discovering this in the archives and what print media kind of means to cities like Baltimore, and how that can help us think today about grounding things in the material reality?
Yeah. So let me summarize that to say, the question is about the sort of importance of print media in a place like Baltimore. And yeah, I mean, what when we look back, of course, at the history that I'm talking about, right? This is pre-internet, right? So print is everything, although of course there's TV and radio as well, right? But print is the way to get your message out, right? So, you think about one of the major organizations that is started in the Black Arts movement is Broadside Press, which is in Detroit by Dudley Randall. And what he does is he publishes poems on like broadsides, sort of big pieces of paper, so that people could like fold them up and put them in their pocket, put them on their wall, really feel like it was part of their life. So again, poetry is not a thing that's on a shelf, another room that you don't really like engage with. It's supposed to be part of your life. And I think that in a city like Baltimore or like where I live in Newark, print media is still critically important because because people are like sort of walking around in their daily lives and are able to sort of integrate that. So you pick up the newspaper, read it, you drop it on a table, the next person picks it up and reads it, right? And these are cities where, of course, people have like internet access on their smartphones or whatnot, but it is so much more visceral, right? In places like Baltimore, I think, to engage with print in that way. And I do also think that there's a way in which print makes things feel more real, more solid, more like, so with Chicory, which is different than a newspaper, although not entirely different, people who are published in Chicory talk about that, like how important it was for them to see the poem that they wrote published in a thing that they could hand to someone else, that there's a real power in that as well. And of course, there's also the issue of control, which is also the big thing, of course, right? It's like, who gets to control the information that we put out in the world? And of course, in the world that we're in today, where like big media conglomerates own everything and really sanitize messages or flatten messages, and local news is missing, right? Then that local control is even more important. So yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I would say that the organizations and activities that I've been focusing on at the moment all sort of begin to sort of fall by the wayside by the early 80s, right? Which is not to say, of course, that like then there's like a desert and nothing is happening, but that sort of Black Arts movement moment, I would say, comes to a sort of conclusion in Baltimore in the early 1980s, except, its legacy moving forward into things like, for example, hip hop music, where you can see the sort of same sort of strains. But yes, I would say the early 80s is kind of the declension moment for that. All right. Well, thank you all. Really appreciate it.
A couple quick things. Mary will be here. We can hang out for about 20 minutes. She's here to chat. If you have completed your survey,
Yeah,
you
please.
can hand it to her or any of our event associates here. And I'm going to take a real quick second to let you know that on Thursday, we're going to continue a conversation about local history. Moravian University history professor Jane Berger is going to be here. She's going to talk about Black public sector workers and unions in the 1960s and 70s here in Baltimore who are addressing economic and racial injustice here in the city. So please come out for that. Also, grab our latest issue of The Compass. It's right over there. We have many, many programs coming up for September, October. Please come out. And again, free parking after 4 o'clock at the Franklin Street Garage. You have no other excuse. No other excuse. Virtual's fine. Virtual friends, thank you. But we would love to see you here. Mary, thanks again.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you.